Change 2.0. I guess, just to give a little bit of historical background, and why this is important to us and why we've been working on it. So when we migrated to ServiceNow, we kept a lot of sort of our old change procedure sort of in place. We decided not to really reanalyze and take a look at, all of the change process and procedure, because we had a whole lot of uplift to do to get off of a tool that was on aging infrastructure, and things like that. So getting off of, footprints within a given timeline, we sort of scoped out doing change management, perhaps the way that we should have done it. So this second effort here, Change 2.0, is really kind of taking a fresh look, reverting kind of what we had built to bridge that gap period, and taking a look at what ServiceNow offers out of the box, and then comparing that with our needs, and seeing where we can basically meet up closer to what the product delivers, when it comes to change, than what we had done in our initial cutover. So that's just a little bit of sort of background. Um, just another thing that I'd like to say, this has been an effort that, I get to stand here and take a lot of credit for, but really a gargantuan effort on the part of project management, all the network teams that we've engaged with to get specs, and so it's really been all hands effort, and so everybody's effort is really what enabled us to really work on this project. So big shout out to everybody who helped on getting this going. Okay, so I'm going to kind of highlight what we'll go through here today. And hopefully there's some questions. There will be some live demo. Hopefully that goes well. You never know. So we're going to talk about the old change form. It's going away. We'll talk about what is going to be replacing it inside of ServiceNow, and we'll talk a bit about the different change types, and you'll see that I referenced ITIL there. We're really trying to stick with the ITIL standards when it comes to change and incident and those various processes. So we're getting back from where we were, where we had different types of changes in sort of our 1.0 implementation, back into ITIL, where everything's either a normal change, a standard change, or an emergency change. And we'll elaborate on what those are here in just a bit. So one thing that I'll stress, which has been very important as we design and develop this, we wanted essentially to be able to reuse as much as possible, but still have the flexibility where we knew that process would vary based on customers, and we fully expect it to vary, and that is in fact what we've found, that there is variance between our customers in terms of the way that they want to do change. So while we were able to, I think, get most of things sort of streamlined and reuse code and things like that, we still have the adaptability and the flexibility to be able to meet each individual customer's needs when it comes to change, both now and in the future. So there are some things that I'll probably show off today that you're unlikely to use as when it first goes out, but think about those in the back of your mind, if they might be something that you would want to explore with us later. So we did try to streamline the process where possible. We had some cases where we had rolled out, certain networks and they sort of did it one way, and then other networks and sort of did it a different way. And that was kind of confusing for the service desk to try to manage the different types of change. Oh, what do we do? Well, it's this network, do that. So we're tried to standardize in terms of process as much as possible. Who would own the change, who would own change tasks, those kind of things. And we'll walk through an example of that. So I think most of the engineers on the call and probably a lot of the service desk staff have seen this form, which it gives me great pleasure to say this will be retired when we move to change 2.0. It got us through. It's worked okay, but it's kind of a lot of fields to fill out. And, some of them are useful, some of them aren't. And it's kind of hard to tell, which field is going to go where within the ServiceNow change. So we're eliminating this layer of abstraction, and we'll be going right into the ServiceNow change record from now on after we roll out change 2.0. So in the ServiceNow model, you'll see a few things here that I want to point out. We've got the left-hand nav. That's what I call this. ServiceNow may have some other name for it, but that's what I always call it. So I typed in change here, and you see a bit of the change menu. And so when I went and I clicked create new, it took me to this page, which is what they call an interceptor. And basically it's an interrupt saying, okay, hey, you want to create a change? That's cool. What type of change do you want to create? And again, we see the normal, standard, and emergency here available as choices. So we'll get into those, I think, on this next slide, sort of what the differences are. And then, yep, so the normal changes, and this is at least, how it's set up for now. The change has to be planned at least 72 hours, so 3 days prior to the actual change event. And then in terms of the variance in the workflow, it has the option to go through a peer review phase, which is called an assessment step. And when I say that it's got the option, that is one of those things that is configurable by each of the networks, whether or not they want to do that. And if they want to do that, then we identify a group of people that would participate in that activity. And then the normal changes typically can also go through a change approval board process, and that's less of an assessment and more of an official CAB type of approval. I don't think that out of the gate anybody is going to take advantage of these approval steps, but I know it is interesting to several people. And I think I may be wrong on that. I think there's maybe one that is going to take advantage of some types of approval. And I know I2 is not going to be far behind them. Okay, and normal changes, much like the web form, you have to fill out all of the required fields every time. So that's sort of what normal is. Emergency is very similar to normal in that you have to fill out all the fields, but it's really for changes that have to be done now, soon, end of day, that type of thing. They get flagged as emergency changes, and those can go through a change approval board process as well. And then we've got the third, and my favorite type of change that I really hope gets widely used, because I think it's really one of the great things about moving to change management inside of ServiceNow, is standard changes. So standard changes, and what those are is going to probably vary from network to network, but those standard changes can be predefined by the network and through an organizationally approved process. So what does this do? This allows the network to say, okay, we're going to have a standard change type of a prefix addition, say for example. That doesn't require approval, but there's always certain things that we want filled in on that. They can go ahead and define a template for those prefix additions and basically be able to rapidly process those changes. Not only do they not require approvals, but using the templating, it can fill out a lot of the required fields on the change form for you based on what's in the template. So we'll see an example of that as well. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit now about the change phases. So this is sort of the header bar that's used within the change module. Excuse me. And so all changes go through most of these phases, depending on the configuration and how each network is set up. So the new phase is really whenever you're starting a change, right after you save it, and before you send it on into the assess, authorize process. So typically, the work breakdown here is going to depend on what type of change it actually is. So if it's an engineering change and you're going to do something on the network, the engineer would either fill out this change or maybe send a note to the service desk that might fill out the change. But generally, it's the engineers putting in the information about the change, and they get to put in the notification information about the change as well. So they're going to basically start the process. Typically, the engineer is going to start by creating the change, and then the responsibility of getting it scheduled, getting notes sent, all of those kind of things are going to be handled by the service desk. And we'll run through an example of that so that that becomes clear. In the case of vendor changes, typically, unless engineering needs engaged for impact assessment, vendor changes are going to be handled by the service desk, right? So they'll go ahead and fill these out for any kind of vendor changes where they're going to do, maintenance in a POP or those kind of things. And typically on the vendor changes, I think whenever the service desk needs to reach out to engineering, they'll do that via change tasks that they create, asking for input from the engineering team on what impact is going to be related to that vendor particular change. So then we move on to what ServiceNow calls the assess phase. So based on the configuration, and so this is what we've set up sort of as a domain option, and each of you guys have your own domains that you live in, you will be able to set up an assessment group. And so I kind of call this peer review. I don't really call it approval. Typically, this step, if you want to use it, is going to go to somebody else within your team, maybe, that would know roughly the intent of the change, be able to look it over, see if you missed anything, review the change text, look at the notification, make sure that, it's a good, appropriate notification and will make sense to mere humans whenever it goes out, and those kinds of things, right? So the assess phase would be a stop phase in this workflow. It's going to basically go from new to assess if the organization is using assess. Oh, I skipped a slide. And it's going to wait there until somebody who is one of the assessors, and that can be a group of people that you define for your network, would come in. One of them would come in and do that particular review of the change. Once they've done that, they would approve generally, unless there was some problem, which they would then go back and probably work with the initiator on. But generally, once they make any modifications, they would approve it. And then we are on to what I call the authorize step. And this one is really more related to the change approval board function. And I'm sure everybody has their own sort of version of change approval. When we're going to make something, it's a big change, it's potentially network impacting, we've got some way that we talk about and communicate that. This is ServiceNow's way to attempt to put a system around that. So if you had a change review board and you had somebody that interfaced with the ServiceNow system that, could be the scribe or whatever, you could batch up a set of changes, review them in the change approval board process, and then ultimately authorize them or reject them based on the change approval board's decision, right? So things are going to stay in this state if this is used. Like I said, and very importantly, I think in terms of out of the gate, most of you guys are going to jump straight from new to scheduled because you don't have existing assess phase or an existing authorize phase set up, although that is certainly something that we can work with you on. Okay, so then it moves on to scheduled. So at this point, it would be scheduled. I think this is probably the point at which it would show up on the operations calendar and be in a change that will be coming. So at this point, it's really the service desk is managing the change itself, because back here when we kicked this off and after things got through approval, it actually generated a change task out to the engineer if it was an engineering change. So at this point, the service desk owns the change. They're going to typically send out the initial set of notifications related to that change so that people are aware that it's going to be happening, right? And then we get to the fun phase for us engineers, which is implement. And so we will have in our change task a way to basically say, all right, we're implementing, and then be able to fill in any work notes we need to take while we're doing the change, and then be able to say that that phase is done. So whenever we are done with our implement, it's going to kick it back to the service desk unless it was a vendor change, in which case the service desk is going to move this along for us. And jump slides again. The review phase. So at this point, activity log gets updated as necessary. The service desk updates with the actual change time. So we always have a projected window, and then the service desk records the actual. And then closing notifications are sent. So that means the change has been completed or reverted or whatever. So that's sort of the review phase. And then if it was closed completed or closed reverted, then it's going to basically become closed and it won't be in anybody's task mon anymore. It's not considered an active task at that point. The other option is if it gets canceled sort of anywhere through these phases, then it's going to automatically move to the canceled state. And a lot of times that's due to, well, we thought we'd be able to do this on this date, but now we really have to do it, 2 weeks from then. So we'd just cancel and reschedule a new change. So that really runs through all the different phases. So that's a whole lot of me talking. So let's see if we can take this for a test drive and make some of these things hopefully sink in a little bit. So I'm gonna give an example in our dev environment because that's where all of this code is still. We are still in development and most of the work's done, but I'm going to log in and I'm gonna impersonate I think Bobby from Aron because they have a pretty nice compact change form and I wanted one that didn't have a whole lot of fields on it to run through this example. And I did set them up with the approval steps. So we'll see how those processes happen and we can basically walk a normal change through the process. Did that share my browser, Corey?
No, we're still looking at your slides right now.
Okay, I may have to stop share and share a different window.
Yeah, depending on how you did your slides, it might make you reshare.
How about we just share the desktop? Then I won't have to keep hopping back and forth. Okay, can you see my browser now?
Yeah, it's a little small, but we can see it.
Okay, I can make it a little bigger. Is that better?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, so the first thing that I want to do, and this is something only admins can do, and we would only do it really in development environment circumstances when we're building out the tools on your guys' behalf. So I'm gonna go ahead and impersonate Bobby Clark from Aron. He is a member of the Aron network engineering team. So for this context, I am Bobby, or pretending to be Bobby, and I'm going to go in and I'm going to create a new change record. So I type in change over here in the left-hand nav, like I talked about, and then we have this create new option. When the create new comes up, we are asked by the interceptor what type of change. In this case, it's not a standard change. I don't have any templates defined in this domain. So let's go ahead and do a normal change. Okay, so Aron's form is not overly burdensome in terms of fields. That's part of the reason why I chose to use this particular form. So this is a demo change for GlobalNOC days. And Let's say that the implementer assignment group is going to be engineering. And so this is pretty neat. What this does here is basically shows us the NOC service desk is going to own the change. And that's not something that we can change. So the change is always going to be visible to the NOC. They're going to be staying on top of all the different changes. But because it's an engineering change, we need our own task to work out of as well. So what this assignees bit lets us do is it lets us say, okay, well, what assignment group, and then what person within that assignment group is actually going to do the work. If you left this blank and the group was round robin, then it would round robin, but typically you probably know who's going to do a given change. I'll go ahead and say, since I'm Bobby and I'm putting it in, that Bobby's going to do the change. So what that'll do once we save this guy off is we'll see that we get a change task generated for our on-network engineering to Bobby Clark related to this change, and any work done in that is going to roll up into the change itself. So what category? This is scheduled maintenance. We are going to do a hardware change, and we are going to replace line card on router. Does that even make sense to the net engers out there? I think that's a valid thing to do. And then we've got, I'm just the programmer guy, but I think that's right. So then we've got some more explicit things related to notification. I think this is really another potential big win for Change 2.0 is that we're making things front and center. So we're expecting that we put in, as engineers, good human readable, descriptive information about the change that will automatically get loaded into the change notifications related to this change. So in the past, what we would have sent in the wording to be used field, maybe part of that got used, maybe part of it didn't. We're really trying to make it so that, the responsibility of what goes out on those notifications is kind of our responsibility as engineers first. The service desk is, of course, going to look at it before they push the button, correct any obvious misspellings, those kind of things. But the intent of the change and having it be fairly human understandable really needs to fall to us. So replacing a line card on router RTR dot ROM dot org. And then we can add additional notification recipients, but this will end up integrating with NIT if we do targeted based notification for changes. So that's another thing I'll talk about here in just a bit. So this is all the required information besides the planned start date. So given that this is a normal change, it has to be at least 3 days out. We'll say it's a week out. So on the 21st. And we have this new option, and this was something that was expressed by several of the networks. They've got some types of changes that they just really don't want to show up on their operations calendar. So we built this new flag to allow for people to say, hide this. And that is all there is to filling out the actual change. So now I'm going to go ahead and save it. So the save step is going to do a couple things. Basically validates all the information, and it generates the change task that I was talking about when we talked about the assignee section. And you'll see that that went to Bobby Clark are on network engineering, and basically is there and would now be in Bobby's list of tasks in his taskmon view, or what other way he looks at his task information. Additionally, he would have gotten a notification in email about it. Okay, so at this point, we're in what was the new phase, right? So now we go ahead and request approval. And so I'll do that. And now we're in what's called the assess phase. And so the reason for that, so I'll just save off this change so that I can come right back to it. So I want to go to the domain configuration. I can't do that as Bobby. We'll do that at the end. Okay, so who's got to approve this? Well, we can always find who's got to approve it down in the handy dandy tab here called approvers. And the approvers in this case are the members of the RON Network Engineering Group. So I didn't get creative and make another group for RON for actual approvers, but I could have. It could be any group of people that we wanted to do this particular assess phase. So let's say that, you know, I'm Tim Johnson. Oh, would help if I could spell. And go ahead and become him. I'm going to go to my approvals. And we see that I have this new requested change. So I'm going to come into it, find out what it's about. From there, I can see a little bit about the change, and I can jump to the change record itself to review it, any of those kind of things. And then ultimately, I'm happy with the change, so I'll go ahead and approve it. All right, so what happens at that point? So let's go back to impersonating Bobby. And back into our change. And we'll see that we're now in the authorize phase. And now you'll see how unoriginal I really was in setting up this demo. So I used the same group, the RON Network Engineering Group, as the CAB group. That's obviously not a real world use case. If the CAB and the assessment group were the same, you probably would just want to use one of them, right? Okay, so in this case, I'm not going to impersonate. I'll go ahead as Bobby and come in and do this approval. And I can do it right from here as Bobby, do the approve. So at that point, this is now in the hands of the service desk. So if I wanted to come in as a service desk person, I could and would come in. I would take a look at things. I'd check for the outgoing notification text, make sure things look right. You know, double check the schedule, validate that with the engineer. Might put a note in if I need to note something, and then I would generate notifications. I'm not going to go through that because notifications is our upcoming presentation. So I'm going to skip that for now. And then that would be it. After I generate notifications, I'm going to wait on my next action until the person who's responsible for implementing it comes in and implements it. So we are Bobby, and Bobby has the task to implement it. And they have a network specific dashboard, which is kind of cool. Okay, so I can see my change task down here in his little network specific dashboard. Neat dashboard. Okay, so I'm going to go into that, and now I'm actually in the change task. So this is related to the change, but it's actually its own task, and it's here, and it's ready for Bobby to basically do the work. So he would come in and he would, do his work, and then ultimately click implement, which is going to actually move the change itself. So if we go back out to the change, we'll see that that not only updated the change task, and so, oh, still open. Close task, sorry. Oh, here's a new feature. So, you're doing one of those changes, it's really late at night, and maybe there's some cleanup work that you need to do in the morning, but you're just too tired to do it tonight. Well, we have a new option for you to spawn an additional SC task to basically do any follow-up work from this change as needed. So that's something that you can choose as the engineer working these change tasks. I'll go ahead and say no. I did all my work. Everything's good to go. Okay, so now we're back up on the change, and at this point, it would be the NOC service desk would basically see this, and it would be ready for their review. At that point, they're going to come in, they're going to fill in the actual end, and then they're going to actually send notifications. Again, basically these will be the closure notes that the maintenance is done, and then they will essentially close the change. Oop. Mandatory fields. So we have closure information, and this is really good for reporting. Any mandatory fields are quite useful when it comes to reporting. So we'll say this change was completed, it was a success, so that would be in our statistics at that point. So now close this change. Okay, so that took us through basically all the different roles that are played on a given change. I'm going to go back to the slides unless there are any questions. Okay, so just recapping what we saw.
Oh, hold up, Brian. I missed a question. Okay. Lance Neal from Lonnie wants to know, does that spawn the SC task generate another change ticket? If not, what does it do?
It creates not a change ticket, so a service request ticket, which is a different ticket type. You wouldn't want it to count as a change task because you're not making it in the change window. It's maybe updating some documentation or something like that, but not core work of the change. So it would generate a service request in ServiceNow terminology. Does that answer the question? Okay, so just recapping what we saw. We saw involvement from Aron Engineering. We saw approvals by the group members that were defined, and involvement of where the service desk would be interacting with this, generating notifications, and all in a very consistent way across all changes. And then ultimately the involvement from engineering in the actual change task record, which is what they would work out of after the change was generated. Okay, so second quick example, and this one I want to get through real quick. I just want to show it off because I think it's really clever, and I can't take any credit for it. This is Camille and Chris from the I2 team. They have been working on a way to do a risk calculator which would determine whether or not approvals would be required for a given change. So if a risk score was, high, then maybe it has to go through peer review. If it was super high, maybe it's got to go through a cab. So they're kind of playing with that concept. So we built something for them. So I'll go ahead and impersonate Chris. And go into the I2 domain. Create a new change, normal. And I'll just quickly fill out these fields because that's not the important part here. I2 network engineering. We'll say it's Camille's, scheduled maintenance, circuit, give Google 10 more gigs. Okay, additional information, no notifications, not important to this demo, and we'll just schedule it out 1 week. Okay, so the engineer putting in the change at this point has completed all of the required information about the change. When they go ahead and save it, the next thing that's going to happen is it is going to bring up a questionnaire, which is actually in the form of a survey built into ServiceNow, their survey functionality. And so we're asking these questions of the engineer. They have to go through and answer these before they can move on with this particular change. So what this is going to do is there's numbers behind each of these. So I'll say, yeah, it's going to be service impacting. We weren't able to lab test it. Planned, but more than 30 minutes to back out. Is it high touch? Yes. Is a member have redundancy? No. Well, probably they do, but we'll just say no for this case. I think no on DWM, and we'll just give it that. And these questions could be whatever made sense for you as a network, right? What are the things that would drive the risk score for you and when you might want to require approvals? So I'll go ahead and submit this. And we'll see what happened here is this generated a risk score that's filled in by that calculator. So Internet 2 is looking at using these risk scores to trigger whether or not assess or authorize should be done. And so that's, sort of a little bit more well-informed based on the risk, based on the answers to the questions that they had asked. So that's all I really wanted to show there. I think it's really a pretty neat piece of functionality that we had to actually build for them, but should be reusable if others desire a similar type calculator for their risk. So the survey asked questions about the changed risk characteristics. The values are tied to the answers. The sum of the answers is scored and calculated and imported into the risk score field. So based on that risk score, the different approvals like assess or authorize could be invoked by the workflow. So the number at which the risk score would require those would be up to Internet 2, and we would just plug those into the system, and then they can basically manage this survey and the questions, and then when we want to actually do approvals.
Hey, Brian, we got a question from Leroy.
Leroy, sure.
Yeah. What is the scale on the risk?
So in terms of the scale in the context of what I was just showing, it's really up to Internet 2. They have a certain risk behind each of the answers to these questions, which is just numerical. So the more risky the answer, meaning it's service impacting, yes, that's probably going to be a higher number, right? And so as you add up all the risks based on their responses, then they're going to drive the approvals based on whether the risk is over like score 13 or something that, matches up with their math. So it's really up to the individual network if you're looking at a survey-based risk score. Does that help, Leroy?
Yes.
Okay. So another thing, and you may have noticed this when I switched between RON and Internet 2, we can have different fields per customer on the change form, and in fact we do for most of them. We can have different fields be required. Some new fields have been added to make the change process better. So I noted the notifications needed, notification text, which is going to move us away from altering the description field throughout the workflow. And then the hiding from the operations calendar, the implementer group, and the implementer. Those are kind of the new fields. And then we can add other new fields if needed, but there's a lot of fields available to us on the change form, and they can be set up to suit your particular network. So the last big bit I want to talk about, and how am I doing on time, Corey? 1:48, 12 minutes?
Yeah, you got about 12 minutes left. And we can,
okay.
These next two, we can kind of extend a little bit. So if we need to go a little bit longer on this one, we can.
Well, this is, in my opinion, the kind of the coolest part. And hopefully my demo goes smooth, but it allows for us to define these templates, which are pre-approved set of change templates for a given customer. And for standard changes, approvals are not required, but the change manager for that particular customer has to approve the change template before it becomes available, right? So any of your engineers could submit a standard change template that would be potentially reusable, but you would need somebody in this change manager role that would review the template for accuracy and whether it was appropriate for being a standard change. The change templates can save a lot of time. They're going to fill out the fields for you on the change request, and they can make the change and change notifications more accurate, because if you fill it in once and really take the time, then you're going to probably have better information in those fields than if you're doing daily work and you really got to get this change put in. So if you think about it before the fact, it's really going to, I think, make the changes look a lot better, and the notifications that go out related to those changes. So like I said, any of our users, any idle user, that's basically all the people that work for everybody on this call, can create a change template, but only people with change manager can approve them. Once they're approved, they enter the template, and we'll basically run through real quick setting up a standard change template. All right, so I'm going to go back to being Bobby. I think I need to unimpersonate first. Okay, now I'm Bobby. So I do what I've done. I type in change, I go to create new, and I'm like, man, this is the 10th time I've had to put in this, particular type of change. I'm sick of doing normal. I want to use a standard change. Oh no, there aren't any in my catalog. So what do? I need to go to template management. From there, I can propose a new standard change template. So what does this look like? I've got to give it a name. So let's call this quick prefix change, or just prefix change. Template description. Call the same thing. Category. I think this is just a standard change. And you can put in sample change requests, but that's not necessary to do. And then you can basically fill in some of these fields that you have to typically fill out on the changes. So this gives us the ability to say, okay, well, this is maintenance are on prefix addition, for example. And we could say adding a new prefix and then maybe parentheses and say put prefix info here, so that when you're doing the actual change, you would know to come in and change out that text, source of impact, internal, and who's going to be the implementer group. This will always be on network engineering, so I can pre-fill that out. It's going to be scheduled maintenance. It's going to be, well, what would we call that? Prefixes, that's other. Okay, expected impact, no impact expected on the network. Notifications needed, and let's say the prefix changes aren't something that RON notifies on, so we'll just say no, and I can take out the outgoing notification text if I wanted from this template. Implementation plan, this is where your mop would go, and so standard steps for doing a prefix change. So you'd put your implementation plan in there. If there was any risk, you'd want a stated risk and back out plan. So this is how do I roll back if bad things happen. And test plan, tested in the lab, if that's like our normal procedure. And then in addition to that, we can pick other fields on change, and we can set those as well. So most of the interesting ones have already been set, and in the interest of time, I'll go ahead and request approval. Okay, so a standard change proposal, you can review this change, standard change my proposals. So if we want to see where this stands now, we have to see the approvers. Well, in this case, I am Bobby, and I use the RON engineering group again for this. So acting as the change manager, coming in, reviewing whatever standard change proposal. I can come in and look at all the details of it, open the record, all those kind of things. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and approve it since I know what I did. And now that I want to come in and do this prefix request, I'm going to do a create new. I'm going to go to standard again, but I'll have an item in here, which is a prefix change. So in this case, I can go ahead and select that type, and we see that it pre-filled all this information for me. And we'll just say, since I'm the one putting it in, I'm going to do it. And all I have to fill in now is the date and who the implementer was, and whether we want to hide it. But if we really wanted to hide these types, we should have done that probably back on the template so that it would apply all the time. So all this other information came in for us, and we can now basically do the save and then do the update. Something's broke about standard change. But the important part that I wanted you guys to see was that when we come in here, all of those templated values came in with me, right? So that is really valuable and time saving and drives consistency in the changes and the change notifications. So back to our slides. So we went through proposing a standard change template, approving it, and then using it from the standard change library. So just a quick mention, I don't have this work ready to show. It's still in development, but one of the things that was asked of us was the engineers didn't like having to go out to the network impact tool, which is yet another tool to figure out the network impact. So we're building a bridge interface between the change management submission form and the network impact tool that will allow them to basically interface with the NIT tool without having to open it up and copy and paste a bunch of information back and forth between two tools. So that I cannot show, but it will be there by the time we go live. So as far as timeline on this, we're basically in full dev now, and big shout out to Nathan Samano. He's been leading this effort on my team. And in April, early May, we plan to finish up development. Most of May will be training. We're gonna, I think, train the service desk first so that they're comfortable, and then train the customers and engineers who can then ask questions of the service desk, etc. Looking at, you know, kind of targeting the beginning of June for our rollout. One of the things about cutting over to this change is it changes all the change workflows. So we're going to cut it over, and it's going to be a hard cut for everybody. All the in-route changes can stay, but any new changes would be done inside of ServiceNow. And any adjustments to this schedule will be widely disseminated through the SSTs and out to the networks. All right, I think I used up all but 1 minute of my time. Are there any questions that I may be able to answer, or somebody else who worked on change?
All right. Last chance for questions before we take a break.
I got to get my tropical tree in the picture here. Hanging out in Hawaii, I wish.
All right. So we can take about a 5-minute break, and then we'll be back here at 2:05. I probably won't go anywhere, but just give people a chance to stretch their legs, stand up for a minute.